Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Strozinski. I'm Senior Vice President and General Counsel at the Massachusetts Health and Hospital Association. On behalf of the MHA team, I'd like to welcome you to today's Compliance Officer Roundtable webinar. A few logistics before we start. If you have questions during the webinar, please enter them into the chat feature as we are in a listen-only mode. The questions will come directly to us and our panel will do their best to address them during the presentation. I also want to take a moment now to thank MHA's 2024 sponsors for their support in underwriting today's webinar, which is just one of many events we have to offer throughout the year to connect our members with leading experts on timely issues like the ones you'll hear discussed today. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator and panelists for the day. Larry Vinalia is a partner and healthcare lawyer at Foley Lardner LLP. With over 30 years of experience, Larry has represented hospitals, health systems, academic medical centers, and other healthcare providers in matters such as Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement, compliance, advice, and appeals, state regulatory issues, managed care contracting, and more. He's also the department chair for Foley and Lardner's Industry Teams Department, which is responsible for overall strategy and leadership across all teams. And he's co-chair of the firm's healthcare and life science sectors providers of healthcare services area of focus. That's a mouthful.
Thanks, Mike.
He's joined by three great panelists today for our Compliance Officer Roundtable. Tim Hogan is the Senior Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer at Boston Children's Hospital. Bob Damiano is the Vice President of Compliance, Audit, and Business Integrity for Mass General Brigham. And Michael McAuliffe is the Compliance Officer for Emerson Health. Thank you all so much for being here today, and we're really looking forward to this discussion. I'll hand it over to Larry now to get us started.
Thanks, Mike, and I appreciate all the efforts of Lori, Amy, and others at the MHA, along with you, Mike, setting up this forum. It's a roundtable that I enjoy every year, and ordinarily we would be together in Burlington, so we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. Please do throw questions into the chat window if you are comfortable doing that. You can also email me at lwv@foley.com if you want to send a super dark email. We can get the questions kicked around. But we're going to run this just like we have in the prior years. The way this panel has always worked is we bring together some very experienced compliance officers and talk about some major themes that are present in the industry among compliance programs, as well as hospitals and health systems generally, and how the compliance program is interacting with them. Our panel picked the themes, and we're going to just sort of wander through them. We've got about a half a dozen or so. We hope to get through as many of these as possible. But I'm going to start off and turn to Mike with, we are now halfway through the year since the OIG's General Compliance Program Guidance was published in November of last fall. I think all of us by this point will have read it and thought about it and figured out how to use it. I'm curious, Mike, as you've looked at it, how have you utilized it, if at all, in your compliance program at Emerson?
Yeah, thanks, Larry, and appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon with a great panel of compliance officers, and appreciate MHA coordinating. I think the OIG program guidance dropped, in November sometime 2023. I guess it was our holiday gift from the OIG. But I think much like other compliance professionals, read through the document, tried to figure out how do we stand against the guidance, and are there opportunities to improve? And I think I read through and I said, oh, it looks like we're doing pretty good here. We're meeting a lot of the, the expectations of the OIG. But then I also thought it allowed for an opportunity for us to step back and then take a look at our overall program and almost conduct like a mini assessment of our compliance program. And we had engaged our compliance committee to participate in that. So it did require a little bit of, manual work in that you had to kind of pick through the document, pick out what the OIG was telling you, what they think you should be doing, and kind of create a listing from there. I was able to really break it down by each of the elements. We put in what were those tidbits of information the OIG is telling you that they think you should be doing. As a primer to engaging compliance committee, I went through and assigned a tag on each one of those. Are we meeting it? Are we partially meeting it? Are we not meeting that today? Brought that back to the committee. We had a discussion about each and every one of those little tidbits, and then came to an agreement. Do we all think we're meeting that today? Do we all think we're partially meeting that today? And then we had some really thoughtful discussion around what can we do differently, or where can we improve the compliance program? And it really did drive two areas. We were able to modify our work plan and prioritize some of those things that we were partially meeting and not meeting. And we were also able to take that and bring it to the board and say, we've done this assessment. Here's where we stand against the OIG's guidance, and here's what we're doing to improve. And they really appreciated that information.
So, we've sort of thought about, was there much new learning out of the general compliance program guidance, or did you think it was old wine, new bottle? And I'm curious about anyone's reactions on that.
I can certainly start. I think that, a lot of it was old news. There was some tidbits in there, that I thought was new. I think that they aligned themselves a little bit with the DOJ around the usage of data and driving the compliance program through data. And there was a little bit more information, I thought, than previously about the intersection of kind of compliance and quality, and how do we, how does compliance have a role in quality as well, and safety?
Yeah, how Bob or Tim, have you been taking a look at the CPG, as they like to call it?
Yeah, that acronym's a mouthful. And I saw that you posted the link in the chat, Larry. Thank you for doing that. Because I do encourage you, for anybody who hasn't read it yet, to definitely take the time. As Mike was just saying, there's not a ton in there that's breaking news. There are some new points of emphasis to stress, which are important to understand. I think the process that Mike just spelled out for how they're using it at Emerson makes a ton of sense to me, and is exactly the right approach. For me, the key takeaway has been, look, the OIG updates their compliance guidance about once every 25 years. So I don't think that it's an exaggeration to say we have a once in a generation opportunity to get the attention of senior leaders and board members at our organizations. People sometimes see me coming, and they know what I'm going to say, regardless of what the topic is. And compliance sometimes can become part of the white noise, right? It feels like when we open our mouths, sometimes it's like the teachers in Charlie Brown, right? Just want. This is an opportunity to cut through that noise. And it's a real, as Mike was saying, it's an opportunity that we shouldn't let slip by, and say, for the first time in 2.5 decades, the OIG has refreshed their guidance, and it's our responsibility as a healthcare organization to take a fresh look at what we're doing, to make sure that we're getting it right.
Yeah, and I definitely am, like Mike's approach, and something I think we're going to aspire to. To date, we've done more of a high-level gap analysis, and then tried to focus in on a couple of those areas that have already been mentioned, the intersection of quality and clinical compliance. And then what is the role of our compliance operating committees? Because we really haven't looked at that in a while, and we've kind of morphed into this, and you may say we've got too many of them, but we've got functional compliance operating committees, so on billing, research, 340B, clinical, environment of care, ACO, and then we have institutional compliance committees. And and not that that's definitely necessarily called out in the new guidance, but just reading about that, it's just kind of a good opportunity to step back and say, do all these committees make sense? Where is there overlap? And are we all looking at risk the same way? And then the other piece that called to mind in thinking of the quality and clinical compliance, and this was something we were dabbling in even before the new guidance came out, looking at all the areas where there's delegated compliance function. So, what's happening in lab and pharmacy and radiology and with animals, and are we all are we being consistent, or at least have standards, in these delegated compliance functions that don't necessarily fall under corporate compliance programs, to at least make sure there's a baseline of standards and activities that are being done, and that there's a mechanism to report out if there are issues identified in those other areas.
Bob, I'm glad you brought up the committee stuff because we didn't actually talk about that when we had any of our prep calls leading up to our roundtable. But I can tell you that from my experience, that's one area where the general compliance program guidance seems a little more prescriptive than I would have expected to see because lots of organizations have really different committee structures, particularly multi-entity systems, than what the general compliance program guidance seems to be anticipating. And I have certainly seen very well-intentioned organizations looking at that and then saying, yeah, but we're still going to interpret the way this management level committee structure operates as works best for us. I don't know if any of you have any similar reactions to that piece of the guidance.
Yeah, I would say like it's an excellent point. The OIG's understanding or perception of how healthcare organizations are structured has not always aligned with the real world, I'll say. And it's a matter of, in my mind, establishing not just a culture of compliance, but a culture that works for your organization. Because we're not going to restructure whether it's our corporate bylaws or the constellation of committees at all of our enterprises that function, or in some cases dysfunction on a daily basis. As long as we're getting the work done, from my perspective, that's the most important piece. There's no one size fits all cookie cutter approach to what an org chart or what a committee structure needs to look like, as long as at the end of the day we're meeting the underlying requirements and we have the appropriate oversight and monitoring from the board level as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, substance over form, I think what works best and most effective for your organization versus trying to fit a prescriptive, checklist from the OIG.
That makes sense to me too. I want to move on to sort of beyond thinking about what the general compliance program guidance teaches us. There are a variety of pieces that I think cause us to focus a little more closely on some areas. This committee piece is one of them. Quality, which you brought up, I thought rightfully, is certainly another one. But I want to turn to you, Bob. One of the things that the guidance talks about is a section that I thought made a ton of sense, where it's asking about new entrants into the healthcare industry, both in terms of new players who might be unfamiliar with the unique regulations and business constraints, I believe is the way the OIG referred to it for the healthcare industry, but also, and they added, healthcare organizations are themselves entering into new areas. For example, providers are offering managed care plans and developing healthcare technologies, and they went on. But I think that was a really reasonable pickup. And I wonder, Bob, as you're looking at maybe new lines of business or diversified revenue opportunities within the health system, how are you tackling that from a compliance perspective?
I mean, if you step back and you think of the provider environment that we're all dealing with, and nationally, we're challenged by this unsustainable force where expenses are growing faster than the rate of our payer contracts. And so that's leading to all of our organizations to look for new lines of business or diversified businesses to help close that gap. And many times these are set up not to depend on our existing revenue streams through payer contracts or even use our traditional operating expense labor. And what we've found is really trying to work to get involved early as these ideas are being planned so that we can be a resource to advise on the compliance risks, versus coming in after the fact and being like the skunk at the picnic, like, oh, you want to do virtual care for patients in Idaho? Well, you can't do it and we can't get paid for it. And so, as things have come up on, expansion of virtual care, making sure, that those teams are factoring in, right, we got licensing risks and malpractice and consents, and can we bill for it? And just, how does that fit into our strategy? Thinking of advisory services, especially when you get into doing things internationally, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and, tax laws. And not that we're experts in tax laws, but, trying to raise the questions as these ideas are being generated. Commercializing AI. I mean, there's a whole variety of things and then something like that. Population health management services, expanding those outside your region. Working with joint ventures. And we're thinking of certain joint ventures, and we have some where we're not the operating unit, and so we're not doing the compliance. So how do we check in on those joint ventures to make sure they're not putting us at risk on the compliance side? So it's really that whole balance that we all try and deal with. We have to react to things when they occur, but how do we get more on the proactive side to prevent things from happening? And as I described this, I don't want to oversell it like we've got this all figured out. I mean, this is a complex area, and our whole world, as you all know, everyone's dealing in complex times for us in healthcare. But so we don't have anything all figured out. But that's just an area and these types of things that we try and get ahead of, be proactive.
Tim, do you have any similar reactions? One of the things that I think about is that a good compliance program with the elements that Mike was talking about can really take on any new regulatory challenge or business environment, because that's the framework for looking at a problem. But the knowledge or the understanding of the new risk areas that show up in those new business opportunities might be a little outside the comfort zone of a compliance officer who's used to fee-for-service reimbursement as the sort of bread and butter of the program. Tim or Mike, do you have any thoughts about sort of how you stretch your muscles a little bit to handle some of those new opportunities?
It's such an important question, because risk tolerance is always an important factor. There's Tim Hogan's personal risk tolerance, but then there's also the institutional or the enterprise's risk tolerance. And Bob has his finger, I think, on the key tension in the dialogue is the question of expense. The healthcare is expensive, and we all want to provide the highest quality care to the greatest amount of patients for the lowest cost. And a lot of the innovations in the new lines of business and the diversified revenue sources, a lot of these are attempts to solve for that problem. So by the time they get to Mike or Bob or me, a lot of the cost has been stripped out to get the most efficient and effective model. Well, we all need to be honest. Compliance is a cost when you're viewing the world that way. And a lot of the regulatory or licensure or other requirements that we insist on come with additional costs. So it's always helpful, as Bob said, when we can be involved in the dialogue as soon as possible, even when an idea may be half-baked or less, so that we can provide input. So that I love the way that Bob put it, so that we're not coming in at the end like the skunk at the picnic.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize that point enough. I mean, compliance having, and this is the age-old saying, right? Does compliance have a seat at the table when some of these things are being discussed? And it goes back to Tim's, comment earlier about culture of compliance, right? And we're trying to breed this culture of compliance within our organizations. And part of that is making sure that when these conversations are happening, that compliance has a seat at the table and has the opportunity to maybe ask some questions that kind of dig into that new service line a little bit, or that new area a little bit, to uncover some of the risks. I also think about, as we're looking to diversify revenue and, expand offerings, we're also trying to, cut expenses as well. And so as those things are happening, is compliance knowledgeable about that? Do they know what's going on? I know Bob talked about earlier about, delegated compliance functions in the organization. And as some of those folks may be leaving the organization, or those roles are no longer part of the organization, is compliance brought into the conversation to say, this control no longer exists here, or this monitoring is no longer going to be happening. So just as much as we're, trying to be involved in the conversation for new business, we also need to understand what's happening in terms of expense reduction, and what does that do to the risk profile of the organization as well.
When you bring up the seat at the table, you're reminding me about several of our roundtables in the past, particularly those during the pandemic. And our roundtable discussants were all saying, we know that the pandemic responses are moving too fast for the compliance program to be activated on all of them. And now we're a few years out, we are seeing some cleanup from that. I think that's a useful learning exercise to say when things are happening fast, when new business, what the kinds of new business opportunities that Bob mentioned are coming up. If compliance is not there on the front end, you can't set up the auditing tools or the risk assessment. I think I want to get to risk assessment before we're done with our roundtable today. But I do think that the pandemic did provide some lessons like, yeah, that's a good way to learn from it.
I think, in the end, trying to reframe it as, I mean, we're there as compliance, but we want to be, understand what they want to do and be a trusted advisor and how to help them meet the goals in a compliant way, up front. So, versus we're not the know people, we're like, how can we help you succeed in your vision?
Yeah, and I think, none of these efforts are ill-intentioned, right? These are, folks that are trying to, they have this great idea in their mind and they want to run with it. But, sometimes it's pump the brakes and we need to take a look at this a little bit more before we, before the plane takes off.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. If compliance wants to be invited and have a seat at the table, you need to be the type of person that people want to invite to the party. And part of that is showing up and not always saying no, but working to help find solutions so that folks can get to yes. And it's always helpful when we're participating as early as possible. Because the other area, Larry, I love the tie that you brought up to the pandemic, because I think that's exactly right. I think the other thing that it makes me think about is, a lot of these ideas and innovations that come to us are cutting edge, bleeding edge, 10 to 15 years at least ahead of today's regulations. So my natural inclination and temperament as a compliance officer is to get nervous when we want to do something that's not directly addressed by regulations. But that's the opportunity for us to get creative and anticipate where the regulations may be 10 to 15 years from now, and how we can drive the process in a way so that we're not just responding to static laws and regulations that exist today, but we're helping create the environment where we're building the structure as we go and having a voice in that process.
Tim, I think that you're sort of channeling a little of what Bob mentioned when he brought up AI in his comments a few minutes ago. I think about Mr. McGuire's comments in The Graduate. There's a great future in plastics, and I've now been telling every young lawyer who will listen that there's a great future in AI. And it's probably one of those examples, Tim, wouldn't you say, where the regulatory environment is playing catch up with the industry. The healthcare environment is solidly focused on AI. I've had 2 meetings this week, one with 15 CEOs, every one of whom had an AI program on their business plan. Yesterday at a bar association event, we were talking about these opportunities in healthcare. Tim, let me ask you the question then. How are hospitals now using this, both in a clinical environment that you're sort of overseeing, and maybe even in the compliance program itself?
Yeah, absolutely. For the record, Mr. McGuire wasn't wrong. Plastics was the future. So Bob correctly pointed out in our prep call, AI is not new. AI has been around for ages in various forms and iterations. What's new is partly the hype and the focus that's around it today. And that's because appropriately, there's a lot of excitement around generative AI and large language models today, and how it can be incorporated in healthcare. And I think compliance professionals and lawyers appropriately and reasonably are focused upfront on the risks that come with that. And we should be, whether it's data privacy or whether it's inclusive treatment of historically underrepresented minorities, to make sure that they're not disproportionately affected by AI tools. These are all really serious and important considerations. For me, what I've been thinking about a lot is in my day-to-day compliance work, how can I incorporate AI so that we're not just leaving it to the researchers and the scientists and the clinicians to come up with processes, but we're taking a look at our day-to-day work. I can tell you, when we were in the early stages of organizing this webinar, the first thing that I did was go to ChatGPT and type in hot compliance topics for hospitals. And as I was doing that, it occurred to me, well, that's the discussion topic to explore. It's how do we use AI? I'm not quite at the point where I know some people are, where there's concern about whether knowledge-based roles like us are going to be rendered redundant by large language models, whether it's Copilot or ChatGPT. But I will tell you, if you go to ChatGPT and you type in, write me a compliance program that meets the OIG's most recent voluntary program guidance, in about 2 minutes, you will get a multi-page document that's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. And you can then type in, write me a compliance program in iambic pentameter with an ABAAB rhyming scheme, and you will get it. And it'll be much better than I could do, certainly. So there's real opportunities for us to do things like that, rather than spend weeks of Tim Hogan's time manually drafting a document, and then weeks, if not months, of committee time going through and reiterating it, so that the blocking and tackling that can be done more efficiently for us, we can start to incorporate that and then spend time where we can really differentiate ourselves as compliance officers. And that's sort of in the human factor and the relationships with people throughout our enterprises. Because as much as ChatGPT can write you a compliance program in about 2 minutes, what it can't do is create that culture of compliance where you successfully implement the program and it truly takes root throughout every role and rank in your organization. And that's where I think we collectively have a lot of value to offer.
Bob, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think Tim's right on, and I'm sure all of our organizations have some sort of pilots going on, and again, a lot of times they'll be focused on research in the clinical side. But like, for example, we have an internal Microsoft Copilot app, and so like the whole compliance team signed up for it, so that we can start using those tools and not to wait till everyone else learns them. And it just
is yours internal only? Yours is internal only?
Yeah, so it's behind our firewalls, the Copilot tool. And again, that's something like where if a meeting is recorded, which has a bunch of other challenges with it, but it'll summarize the meeting, and you have a long email, it'll summarize the email, some long email chain that'll summarize emails for you. So it's definitely handy. I would definitely agree with him. We need to embrace it. And I'll just a quick funny story. I had an open position. The recruiting people said, "Oh, you should put this on LinkedIn." So I put this thing on LinkedIn. We're hiring, and one of my kids in their 20s, they called me like laughing, like that is like the worst post on LinkedIn I've ever seen. But what we do at my job is that we go to ChatGPT and say, help me word of posting for LinkedIn, and it does it for you, and it gives you something much better. But I totally agree with Tim to embrace them as much as you can and be part of the pilot program. So it'll even give you a better understanding of the risks to look for as it's rolling out, hospital-wide or system.
And Bob, you answered one of the questions that showed up in our chat window by one of the attendees who's asking if the organization has built an internal generative AI tool. And she adds and to dissuade folks from going out to ChatGPT, which feels like both a tool design and a policy design.
So what we've done is, so I don't know if I would say we generated our own, but they're taken existing tools like ChatGPT, Copilot, and other areas and have like our own install of it so that it's protected. And then there are also policies that clearly state using these tools, and especially if you're using them outside, if you're using a public version of ChatGPT, you can't put any patient information or research participant information or PI or any confidential information. But it's a challenge because even sometimes on Zoom or there are many tools that people will try and procure or get for download for free that will offer to summarize meetings, and people don't realize what they're signing up for, and that it'll record all their meetings and look at all their emails and calendar and activity. And so it's kind of a whack-a-mole for the security folks to take those off when they find them and communicate out that you shouldn't be using those tools, only permitted tools and allowed.
So you all have a formal policy that says don't do it, don't use one of the external tools?
So there's been a lot of communication about it. We already had existing policies about software, acceptable software. So we already had the policies in place. Tim said AI has been around for a while. It's part of the data protection policies, but just reinforcing through education, communication, that how these tools, how AI, and how these policies, interact with AI.
And Mike or Tim, how are you folks handling it from a policy perspective?
Well, I think, much like Bob said, I think we're handling it we do have a policy and procedure, which, is in draft form now. We're getting it through the approval channels, but we're also leveraging existing committees and governance structures to bring it through for approval, just like we would any other technology product that we have within the organization. The only thing that, I struggle with a little bit today and I've questioned internally is, those existing structures, are there the right people? Are there the right people at the table, and do they have the right level of knowledge related to AI to be able to make some of these decisions about, whether we should move forward or maybe rethink, this usage of AI?
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, that's the approach that we're taking is, it sounds like it's aligned with Emerson and MGB. It's for us mostly reminding folks about existing policy. Because a lot of the risks that are brought up by AI aren't all that different from the risks that are brought up by any new technology. And we have a governance structure in place for how we evaluate and deploy tools. We do have a internal instance of ChatGPT within our own firewalls, so that if folks are interested in using, it's not just protected health information or personal information, it's also confidential business information. I don't think it's widely understood that when you use publicly available tools, that your data then becomes part of the model. Yep. So we do have an internal instance within our own firewalls that people can use. But the takeaway for me is it's a new technology. There's a lot of excitement around it, and I'm sure that we'll come up with ways to deploy it that we haven't even considered yet today. But it just happens to be what we're talking about today. A couple of years ago, it was Slack. And how is that going to be deployed? Because people are already using it. Well, and folks may remember the summer of 2018, 2019, when everybody was concerned about how Pokemon Go was going to present a privacy risk to patients. Maybe that was unique to Children's Hospital.
Might have been. Yeah.
But it's the newest thing, and what's most important is to set up a governance structure so that as the next thing, which we can't predict today, emerges, that that we handle it in a consistent way.
You go ahead, Bob.
Well, I was gonna say, just for, if anyone's of interest, so HCA, they post all their policies online. And I don't remember I remember it being pretty comprehensive. So they've got an AI policy that you may find useful if you're looking to start with somewhere and you want to see something that's already published. So HCA publishes all their policies online. Maybe a good source to look for.
Yeah, we'll try to grab it and post it in the chat window. But Tim talked about having appropriate governance in place. Mike talked about having the right people at the table. 2 summers ago, some of our California hospital clients got a letter from the Attorney General of California, Rob Bonta, where he wrote to the hospitals and said, give me a list of all the commercially available purchase decision-making tools. And it was just defined extremely broadly that you've got. Tell us the purposes that you're using them, how they'll inform decisions, and then give us the name and contact information of all the people you have overseeing this. And it was one of those questions that no one could possibly answer in August of 22. We didn't have that assessment. And so, and we didn't have the team involved, but you're now, both of you have brought up the items, I think, that hit it. And your initial remark, Tim, was that the regulations haven't even caught up with the business yet. I think that's right. So you're challenged as a compliance officer, like what structures do you put in place? What audit do you put in place when you don't have a rule to audit against? We now have a pretty good executive order from the Biden administration that came out last fall. I'll put it in the chat window if I get around to it. If you haven't read it, it's worth skimming. And one of the takeaways is their very first point is around patient safety. So the first questions that came out were about bias, as you said, right, Tim? That was right on. But I think the Biden administration is right on about thinking about it from a patient safety perspective. We also just got this spring, just 3 weeks ago, new HHS regulations implementing Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act around non-discrimination. And that rule got a lot of press because of what the administration was doing to sort of undo some of the prior administration's activities around gender affirming care. And that's where a lot of attention was paid to that. But there is a provision of that rule that also speaks to healthcare providers that use algorithms or devices or tools, including AI, that are consciously selecting for suspect classifications, age, gender, background, and such a thing. So the regulation is now out there, and that's the first one that I've really seen that is specifically tailored to looking at AI and the impacts. So I want to do a little brainstorming with you all here. We've got, thank you for the reference, Bob, to the HCA policy, but what are some of the other risks that your compliance program is thinking about driven from AI? Do any of you have any you want to share? I've put a couple of them out there, and Tim mentioned a couple.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead, Bob.
No, you're good.
Okay, I was going to say, I think it was mentioned, one of the things that Tim mentioned, I think, is, patient privacy and disclosure of information and personal information, and even business information. Folks that are using these tools, do they understand? I think back to the point of once this is in the tool, it now becomes part of that model. And do they really understand, what the back end risk is associated with, inputting this information into, into the tool. The other thing that, I get a little bit nervous about as a compliance officer is any AI models that start to get into documentation and code selection from a provider perspective. And, if we're going to adopt any of those tools, we need to really understand kind of the algorithms of how that's being deployed.
I think of our tenets about, from our AI governance committee, it's not compliance, it's AI governance overall. It's like, and a lot of things mentioned, reliability, safety, the benefits in ROI, regulatory considerations, ethics, equity and bias, privacy and security, transparency, and informed consent. Those are kind of the key areas of focus or key pillars of built into our governance program.
Can you drill down a little bit, Bob, on your thoughts around informed consent and the interplay with AI?
Well, and again, we haven't updated our, there are some organizations that have changed, that have already gone through and changed their privacy notice about use of AI. We haven't done that yet, but we haven't taken action on it yet, but is when would we, based on what we're doing, when would we say we should get a consent from a patient or someone that were, AI was used in their treatment? So we haven't done anything yet, but that's
well, curious. I'm sure your consent doesn't require any patient consent for use of any other clinical practice guidelines, whether written down on pieces of paper or generated by a computer. I think that's a very interesting question. Tim, have you folks given similar thoughts to the role of informed consent and AI?
Well, what it also means to me is it comes down to patient expectations, because in a lot of ways, that's what informed consent is all about. And do patients truly understand how we're leveraging tools? And are we delegating decisions that a patient would expect that a human to make to technology? So the patient's expectations, to use a privacy example, I think we've all been in the position where we understand what HIPAA requires and we understand what state data protection law requires, but patient expectations are higher than that. And where do we set the bar for which standard we're going to meet? Because to the greatest extent possible, we always want to meet the expectations and provide the highest quality of care to our patients. Even when that, or I should say, particularly when that exceeds the minimum requirements that may be set by a law or regulation. So it really underscores for me the importance of, we need to have these conversations within our enterprise as a starting point, but making sure that the voice of patients and families are part of that, so that we don't come up with what we think is a fabulous solution, and then we hear from the people that we care for who say, well, that's not what we want.
Well, it sounds like all three organizations have managed to see this new tool developing and have already started activities around the compliance challenges that might be raised by it. But that's not the only way new compliance issues hit your radar. I'm going to ask Mike a minute about when a truly disruptive activity, and in this case, I'm thinking about the Change Healthcare cyber attack arises, and that causes compliance apparatuses within healthcare organizations to get activated. How did that impact you, and what was the compliance program's reaction or result from it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive event, right, Larry? So, I just recently read something that it's estimated that the Change Healthcare data or cyber incident may impact up to 1/3 of the US population. So this is a massive, event that we're talking about. And of course, we're notified and compliance is activated and information security is activated, and we try to go into, into incident response and try to figure out what's happening, what's going on. We disconnect ourselves from, all of the change systems, and, then we start to unwind from it. And one of the biggest impacts for us is that our online bill pay system was no longer available. And back to Tim's point around patient expectations is that we're now receiving a lot of phone calls from patients to say, why can't I pay my bill online anymore? And at first, we were saying we're having technical difficulties, but as the situation evolves, and the Change Healthcare incident becomes more public, we're starting to disclose to patients that, this is a a system that's administered through change, and they're experiencing a data incident, and we do have alternative solutions for you to pay your bills, but then it turns into frustration from the patient because we can't tell them any further information about whether their data was impacted or what we're doing to further protect their data. And I think we're getting that pressure, from patients on one side. Internally, folks are saying, should we be doing something more? Can we do something more in relation to this? And we're just, in a holding pattern because we're not getting a lot of information from change, and, that they're still trying to recover and determine what exactly happened here. The only other, comment I'd make around it is it starts to make you think about lessons learned and what can we do differently. I think when we talk about, third parties and evaluating our third parties, I think everyone probably has a system in place to evaluate those third parties and look at their security program, look at their privacy program, and see what level of risk they pose to the organization as you get ready to do business with them. And I think when you look at an organization the size of Change and the resources that Change has, on paper, their information security program looks great. So why would you not, move forward with a vendor like that? They have all the shiny tools and the, bells and whistles in their security program, and they have certifications over their information security program. So why would this present any abnormal level of risk to us? But the one thing I've, started to think about is a lot of times with these data incidents and these cyber incidents, there's some element of human error or human interaction that contributes to it. So did somebody download malicious software, or did somebody click on a link that they weren't supposed to? And are we placing enough emphasis in that review process around what they do to educate their employees, instead of just asking, do you have an education program? Well, show us, how robust that program is, and help us feel better about, your education to employees, because 9 times out of 10, a human's making the error that leads to these massive events.
We could spend a whole day talking about vendor management, and we have tried to from time to time, but you certainly raised a terrific point that's the spotlight's on because of change. Tim, you were nodding as Mike made his comments. Did that, have you had any other thoughts or reactions to how to respond to the change incident, or what you learned from it?
To me, it comes back to patient expectations again, because prior to February, whenever it was, how many of our patients have ever heard of Change Healthcare? Or
how many of our compliance officers have never heard of Change Healthcare?
And the understanding of to what a tremendous extent the entire healthcare industry relies on this one vendor. And we can all say from a legal or from a compliance standpoint that this is a change event when you do the HIPAA analysis, and that they have the responsibility to deal with it. And I know there's a lot of questions that haven't been settled yet around notification and reporting and all of that. And it underscores the fundamental question of how much responsibility for things like that do we delegate to our vendors, versus how much of a responsibility do we feel that we have because they are our patients? Should the communications be coming from us rather than a vendor that the patients have likely never heard of? Because that raises the question, and I'm just raising questions here. I don't pretend to have any of the answers, but it raises the question in the patient's mind when they get a notice from somebody that they've never heard of before. The first thing they're going to ask, well, who thought that it was a good idea to give them my information, and why? And it's a reasonable question that we need to be prepared to answer.
I mean, the only thing I would add, and it's funny, as a consumer, you almost become numb to all these notifications, but I'd say our significant privacy incidents have been third-party driven, and even thinking of Move It, we had a few vendors where Move It was a problem. I guess the tactical thing to think about with any of these third-party relationships that hasn't already been discussed is making sure that you're only sending the minimum necessary to these third parties. You know, we've had situations where we kind of look back and said, oh, why they didn't need all that information. And, you know, making sure that we're, you know, being prudent and only setting what's minimally necessary.
You know, one of the thoughts here when thinking about change also is what sort of alternates and backups and other ways of getting those claims out the door do healthcare organizations have? And it feels like not at least a few didn't have any opportunity for a planned option, which goes to a question of risk management. I think, you know, it's a, you know, we now have been confronted with this, and so when you're thinking about risk management, these kinds of issues have always been on your radar. And it goes back to the first point that I think that Mike was brought up regarding the OIG's general compliance program guidance, and they've got lots of comments, I thought, on risk assessment and what it is that organizations should be doing. And they say compliance officers should continue to scan for unidentified or new risks. They're thinking about new law changes and new developments, but this is certainly one of them. So as you're thinking about risk management, does the Change Healthcare issue fall more into an enterprise risk management bucket? Is it a compliance enterprise risk management, a compliance risk assessment issue, or something in the middle? It certainly elevates the risks of these third-party data channels, but sort of where should this ball be passed to? Is it the compliance program's ball? I don't know if Bob has an initial reaction to that question, or ambiguous.
So for us, for enterprise risk, or for us, third-party relationships, it falls under enterprise risk, and compliance is a component of it, as well as business continuity and you know all the other risks associated with third parties. But so it isn't, you know, for us, it's seen as an enterprise risk, not solely a compliance risk. Compliance is just one component of it. And we, you know, coming out of identifying this risk a few years ago, we've set up a separate third-party risk management process, you know, to process third-party risk relationships, to try and flag whether it's, you know, financial, reputational. You know, there's always been a security component for third parties before they could get access to PHI. But, you know, looking at subcontractors, business continuity, and so really tried to formalize this risk. But as Mike said, change would have flown right through. Change wouldn't have been one that we would have said, no, we're not doing business with. It should raise the question, what's the business continuity plan if they go out of business? But, you know, change, you know, it wasn't a significant impact to us. Fortunately, you know, it impacted one of our hospital's outpatient pharmacies. You know, Interqual was down for a couple of days, but it didn't really impact our claims going out. It impacted our health plan paying claims, but you know, change would have gone through. Change wouldn't have been stopped through that process.
Any learning, Tim, from your point of view?
I think Bob's exactly right. It's not, in my mind, either or. It's both and. It's both a compliance risk and an enterprise risk. And at the end of the day, that can be said for almost any enterprise risk, because healthcare is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the entire country. There's literally at least one law or regulation that governs everything that we do. So I don't want to say that the tail should always wag the dog, and just because there's a law or regulation that compliance needs to be involved in assessing every risk. But to go back to the beginning and Mike's most important point about being invited to the table, it's having a voice in the discussions and the dialogue around how do we identify risk, how do we manage it, and then how do we continually revisit our strategy to make sure that we're keeping up with the real world.
And I think that the whole conversation about risk assessment is timely. We've known that risk assessment is something that's been expected of the compliance programs for many years. But while everybody's got a lot of the structural issues down relating to generating a new compliance program, I think risk assessment is still one of those little bit of a Wild West approaches. Every organization does it a little bit differently. And one of my learnings from the general compliance program guidance is the OIG's expectation of greater discipline, I think, around risk assessment. To me, that's one of the takeaways from that publication, not the least of which is the expectation that it's done annually. That's sort of just a simple little timing issue, but certainly not one that every organization has followed. When it comes to thinking about risk assessment, have any of you taken any additional steps or looked at it from a new lens, either following the OIG's guidance or just as the program has matured, that you feel like you might want to share with the group in our last couple of minutes together?
Well, I think the comment I make here, Larry, is I think, you brought it up, that OIG seems to have, a lot to say around the risk assessment process, and can't stress the importance of the risk assessment process. But, it is a little bit like the Wild West in that, I think if Bob was to outline his process and Tim was to outline his process and I was to outline my process, they'd be a little bit different. And that's okay, right? The importance is that we have some exercise to identify risk. I think, the one thing that I try to do year over year is take a look at the process and see if there's any opportunity to improve it, much like we do the overall compliance program. What worked, what didn't work, what could we do a little bit differently? How can we tweak it to just get a better, to wrap our arms around, risk, as a whole.
Bob or Tim on that?
Yeah, it's still taking shape, right? It kind of reminds me of 20 years ago when we first started seeing quality indicators being incorporated into payer contracts and reimbursement models, where the first couple of years, everybody was picking their favorite quality indicators that they thought were the strongest drivers. And what we ended up with was an immeasurable number of indicators to try to keep up with. And over the years, sort of a prevailing industry standard starts to take shape where there's a common understanding. And we're still in a space today, I think, where a lot of folks are picking their favorite quality indicators, but we're seeing less and less variation and more standardization. And that takes years, if not longer, to settle up.
The only thing I'd add there, I think gone are the days of like just looking at the OIG work plan and saying these are going to be the priority areas for us because that's what the OIG is telling us. I think that the expectation is that there is a real deeper dive into it and that we uncover those risks and try to address them the best we can.
We're coming to the end of our time together, and there's Mike giving me the hook. All right. But I could have spent a lot more time with my friends because it's a really interesting conversation. I'm so grateful, Bob and Tim and Mike, that you shared your time with us this afternoon. I hope the folks who dialed in, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but I hope we touched on most of the critical ones. I'll hand it back to you, Mike, but thank you all for your time and thoughtful comments on this topic.
Thanks, Larry, and I hate to end the conversation, but we're running out of time. Larry, thank you for once again hosting this. A special thank you from MHA to Tim, Bob, and Mike for sharing their insights and thoughts today. It was really helpful to listen in on the discussion. I know our attendees will be leveraging what they heard within their own organizations. I also want to thank all of you watching today. I think we're going to put a QR code up here on the screen. You can scan that to see all of MHA's upcoming programs. We have several events coming up over the next several months and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.